Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday, June the 20th. It's Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all our fathers out there. In particular, a shout out to my dad, Bill Bliese, still preaching and teaching at 92 years old in Bozeman, Montana. I hope it's a special day, not just for my dad, but for all dads. Today we have a very special topic. It's a question. Who was Jim Crow? Who was Jim Crow? And this is part of our racial justice series here at Emmanuel. And the reason we want to take a look at who was Jim Crow, to take a look at this question, is because when we read the papers, when we look at the news now, people are talking almost weekly, if not daily, about the Jim Crow laws. And to be quite honest, I knew a little bit about the history of the Jim Crow's law, but just about that much history. And so this is to provide some information so that when you read in the paper, you know the background of the discussions. Now, often it's discussed today concerning election laws in Georgia, in Texas, in Florida, in Arizona, in North Carolina. We will not be discussing how Jim Crow laws either fit or don't fit into those discussions. But again, this is to give you background information. So when you read and hear those sentences and those statements about, well, that's Jim Crow 2.0 or that's not Jim Crow 2.0, you've got the background information on hand. Now, here's what happened to me. I was in a group and they were discussing, actually, they were quite articulate about Jim Crow laws. They really knew their stuff. They knew their history, and I was impressed. And they were talking about these election laws. Some thought this was Jim Crow laws 2.0. Others could forcefully argue against it, but they knew the history, this 100-year history, especially in the South, about what those laws were. And so let me just review some of the things I learned from them about the Jim Crow laws. As I mentioned, I knew a little bit, but I didn't know a whole lot. So the Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. And they existed for about 100 years, from the end of the Civil War right up until 1968. And their purpose was meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them or suppressing the right to vote, to hold certain jobs, to get an adequate education, and other opportunities. And those who attempted to defy these Jim Crow laws, especially again in the South, often faced arrest, jail, violence, death, and all sorts of obstacles and difficulties. And the roots of Jim Crow began immediately after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And again, our group is discussing all this stuff. They're quite fluent in their history. I learned so much because the legal system under Jim Crow laws was stacked against black citizens with, here you go, former Confederate soldiers who were now working as police and judges, and it made it difficult for African Americans to win court cases, to get justice in courts. And so these Jim Crow codes worked in conjunction with labor camps. And so if you were judged to have broken these laws, they would put you in the labor camps. And basically these prisoners worked as, again, enslaved people. And interestingly for me, the KKK became one of the most ruthless organizations that formed in the Jim Crow era as, first of all, a private club for Confederate soldiers. Former Confederate soldiers. So all that I learned from this group, like I knew, they knew their history a lot better than I knew mine. And so then the question was, okay, if these Jim Crow laws were negative, and if they were both about individual behavior and systemic issues, and all agreed on that. They all agreed that this was not a period we should be proud of as Americans, as far as these laws were really militated against one group, African Americans thriving in the United States. Everybody agreed on that. The question was, did it also apply to today? laws that we're making after 1968. And we're not going to go into that today. We're just trying to take a look at the history behind the arguments one way or the other. And I'm interested because as a 13-year-old boy, I went to work. We were living in Virginia at the time, and I went back to Maryland to a farm right next to the church where my dad was pastor, and they invited me to be a worker on the farm that summer. So I lived in the farmhouse with Marge Street. And we had about 12 to 13 work hands, farm hands, that would work all day. And for lunch then, they didn't make much money, but boy, we ate well. We'd sit around the table, all 12 of us, and we'd eat just plate loads of steaks and mashed potatoes and corn on the cob, all fresh vegetables from the garden. And everyone would gather around the table except for one man, and his name was John Revere. John Revere. A black man in his 50s, and he'd always stay out in the kitchen. Well, I wondered why the black man stayed in the kitchen while we whites were all enjoying our lunch around the table. And so I asked Marge Street. Now, Marge Street was not only my boss, but when I had been younger, she was also my Sunday school teacher. And so I asked her, and I could sense that she felt a critique. And I was just trying to understand, why does John Revere stay out in the kitchen? And so she told me, and this is what I remembered. She said, Rick, this is not the Jim Crow South. She said, she looked right at me. This is not the Jim Crow South. If he wanted to come in and eat with the rest, he'd be welcome to do so. And I've invited him many times to join the group, but he prefers, it's his choice, to stay out in the kitchen. Now, there are all sorts of dynamics at play there. Maybe John Revere stayed out in the kitchen because he felt he'd be critiqued, or he felt that was his place. That was what he learned in the Jim Crow South. However that played out, I'm never quite sure, but I remember her saying, we're not the Jim Crow South, and as a 13-year-old, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. And so in this group, as we discussed Jim Crow laws, both this Jim Crow this and Jim Crow that, I finally realized, and the question came to my mind, and I asked the group, well, who was Jim Crow? I didn't know, and I didn't have my phone with me, so I couldn't Google the answer. So I asked everyone, and although they were articulate about Jim Crow laws, no one in the group knew who Jim Crow was. And so I want to show this brief film about how Jim Crow, who he was, and it all comes from a minstrel act, a character in a minstrel show many, many, many years ago. Please watch this video and know that this is some of the information that will help you when you read the paper and when these issues of Jim Crow laws are discussed. Enjoy.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Let's Teach channel, where we research interesting facts and share information on just about any topic. In a previous video, I talked about who Uncle Sam actually was. When you get a minute, check it out. In this video, I'll answer the question, who was Jim Crow? Let's get started. If you still remember your American history classes back in high school, then there's a good chance that you're familiar with the term Jim Crow. This referred to racial discrimination in the South, particularly to the set of discriminatory and repressive laws that were once enforced by the United States to restrict the rights of black people. Among these many policies were the segregation of schools and public areas to keep the coloreds and the whites from mixing with each other. Interracial marriages and cohabitation were also prohibited, with the former declared null and void in states like Georgia and Arizona. These laws have been largely eradicated, but Jim Crow continues to be used today, describing the systemic segregation and racial discrimination still experienced by black people in the South. While the term is closely associated with the South, its roots aren't actually Southern. In fact, we can thank the North for popularizing Jim Crow. So here are the origins of Jim Crow. In the early 1830s, a white actor named Thomas Dartmouth Rice, a native of New York City, began performing a theater act called Jumping Jim Crow, or Jump Jim Crow, which involved him painting his entire face black before proceeding to sing and dance in a way that he claimed had been inspired by a black slave. He would put on not only blackface makeup, but the shabby dress that imitated in his mind and in white people's mind of the time, the dress and aspect and demeanor of the Southern enslaved black person, says Eric Lott, the author of Love and Theft, Blackface Minstrelsy, and the American Working Class. At that time, caricaturing the physical characteristics of black people were popularized acts in minstrel shows, with working class whites vying for a front row seat to a spectacle that endlessly poked fun at the coloreds. Because of this, Rice's routine was a huge hit and quickly spread throughout the North, even going as far as England. He began touring different parts of the United States, performing the same act to crowds that steadily began to increase with each new show. As expected, Rice's popularity meant that his stage name slowly seeped into popular culture, and before long, it was being used to refer to black slaves in the country. In 1852, it was even written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her timeless classic, Uncle Tom's Cabin, where one of the characters refers to another as Jim Crow. The ubiquity of Rice's minstrelsy routine eventually paved the way to Jim Crow becoming a derogatory term for black people, reducing them to the caricature that he played on stage. They were no longer seen as individuals with rights and emotions. Instead, they were merely a cartoonish version of a human being, something to be humiliated and laughed at. After the Civil War, many Southern states began to enforce laws that served to discriminate against the newly freed African Americans. And by the 1890s, these had gained the nickname Jim Crow Law. Here's a quote from back then. Travelers on the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad during the present months have noted the drawing of the color line in the passenger coaches. Captain Tilley is unceasing in his efforts to see that the color line, otherwise the Jim Crow Law, is literally and fearfully enforced. That's from an article in the Goldsboro Daily Argus in 1899 titled How Captain Tilley of the A&NC Road Enforces the Jim Crow Law. Jim Crow began as an innocuous stage performance, a source of entertainment for working-class white Americans seeking a few laughs after a rough day of backbreaking labor. However, the term ended as a set of laws that did nothing but dehumanize an entire race, wholly integrating itself into the country's systems and whose ramifications can still be felt today.